Okay. So we've just been talking about anaplastic cells, poorly differentiated. Now we're going to talk about, we're talking about functional differentiation. We talked about morphological differentiation, and now we're going to talk about functional differentiation. Okay? So the better differentiated the cell is, the more likely it is to resemble its normal counterpart, and the more likely it is to do what it's supposed to do functionally, which is kind of what we talked about this morning. So for example, a well-differentiated squamous cell carcinoma is going to produce keratin, or it produces keratin pearls. A poorly differentiated squamous cell carcinoma will not produce keratin because it doesn't have the capability to, because it's anaplastic. It has to differentiate to be able to produce the keratin by the cell, okay? Or its substances, whatever it is. Like, I think an example, a poorly differentiated adrenal gland tumor may not secrete whatever it would normally secrete, aldosterone or glucocorticoids if it's poorly differentiated. But a well-differentiated tumor, malignant tumor, can still be just as bad. So I don't want you to just think, oh, it's well-differentiated. You have to look at everything else. But a well-differentiated tumor usually does have a better prognosis, but not always. So as anaplasia increases, the ability of the cells to function or to produce whatever its protein is usually lost. So with increased anaplasia, loss of functional differentiation. I should have got some water. So this is an example of keratin pearls produced by squamous cell carcinoma. So it's these little pink concentric whorls of eosinophilic material. Okay, and these are the squamous cells that surrounding it, and so it's producing it in the center. Same here, same here. So this is a well-differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. Some cancers produce fetal proteins that are not produced by the counterpart cells. So you may have neoplastic cells producing, and this is when it's more anaplastic, producing something it produced when it was a fetal cell or embryological cell that it would not produce once it's a grown-up cell. That's to put it. So it's less mature, producing the things that it did produce when it was less mature, and then so that's another feature of anaplasia. Some cancers of non-endocrine origin may secrete endocrine-like hormones. So they're doing something that they really have no business doing. Usually when you have a cell do that, that's called a paraneoplastic syndrome. Okay? It's important to know certain paraneoplastic syndromes because they're very characteristic. They're keys to tell you what may be going on. An example of that is when you have hypercalcemia of malignancy. That's one of those very common paraneoplastic syndromes where you have cells that don't normally produce parathyroid hormone, producing parathyroid hormone. That's probably the best example for this, where cancer cells produce endocrine hormones even though they're non-endocrine cells. Okay, so they have differentiated to do something they don't normally do. The tumor that there's multiple, but one of the more common tumors that produce parathyroid hormone-related protein is the apocrine gland adenocarcinoma of the anal sac that we talked about earlier. So anal sac adenocarcinomas, they don't always do this, but one of the paraneoplastic syndromes characteristically associated with that tumor is going to be hypercalcemia of malignancy. And you get the hypercalcemia because, thank you so much. All right. hypercalcemia because the neoplastic cells are producing parathyroid hormone-like protein or parathyroid hormone-related protein. So you may see it written capital P, capital T, capital H, and then a little r, little p, and that's the abbreviation for parathyroid hormone-related protein. Okay. And so what does parathyroid hormone do? Increases calcium. Yes. So that's why you get that hypercalcemia of malignancy. Okay. Another tumor associated with that hypercalcemia of malignancy is T-cell lymphoma. Just FYI. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the growth of neoplasms. Most benign tumors grow slowly, and most malignant tumors grow rapidly. The length of the cell cycle is shorter in neoplastic cells than it is in normal cells. Because in normal cells, they go through their checkpoints, they go through that G1 phase, kind of chill there, then they go on to the S, and so it takes its time. It does everything it's supposed to do. And then some of them will go out into the G0 phase, and then they may come back in if needed. So that's normal. But with the neoplastic cell, they just kind of speed through. So they're constantly dividing. So that's one of the things that contribute to the growth rate. What's more important for the growth rate is actually the fact that they don't respond to stimuli to stop growing and to die or to become apoptotic. So you don't get that cell loss. That's the most important factor. But the fact that they have a shorter cell cycle also contributes. Just to remember the cell cycle. After the cell divides, usually it becomes quiescent unless it needs to divide again, and it's just there. Unless something happens where you need to become hyperplastic or you need to respond to something, and then you go back into the cell cycle to divide again. And normally, within the cell cycle, you have these DNA damage checkpoints. So if something's wrong, the cell can either be repaired by DNA repair proteins, or it can be eliminated by apoptosis. But within neoplasms, you tend not, at least early on, you don't go into the G0 part of the cell cycle, or the I'm not going to divide anymore, and you may skip these checkpoints. So all that contributes to the increased or the decreased time within the cell cycle. Growth fraction is the term that means the proportion of neoplastic cells that are active in the cell cycle, and the percentage of cells actively dividing at a given point in time. Well-differentiated tumors have a higher proportion of cells in the resting phase, so their growth fraction is going to be less. And poorly differentiated neoplasms have a higher proportion of cells in the cell cycle, so they have a higher growth fraction. So this is showing you examples of some proliferation markers, which you can use to determine basically how fast this tumor is proliferating. And also the markers can be an indicator of which part of the cell cycle they are in. Usually rapidly proliferating cells are more aggressive. They're going through that cell cycle really quickly, so that can be a prognostic indicator of what this tumor is going to do and what it means for the patient clinically. So the reason it's color-coded is it's showing you the common markers and where they are in the cell cycle. So Ki67 is a proliferation marker, and it's actually present in all the stages of the cell cycle. Okay. PCNA, it stands for proliferating cell nuclear antigen, also present in all of the phases of the cell cycle. Mitotic index is simply in the when it's mitotically dividing, so in the M phase. And the, what does this stand for? bromodioxyuracil or tritiated thymidine, which is a radioactive marker, actually binds to the DNA, and so you only see this in the S phase of the cell cycle. But the main thing I want you to take home from this, not so much when and where in the cell cycle it is, but just to know that these are proliferation markers that you can use to kind of assess the growth fraction of the neoplasm. Okay? These are just four common ones. So there's a lot of significance to this when it comes to treating these tumors. Tumors that are rapidly dividing or within the cell cycle are more susceptible to chemotherapy. And it kind of seems counterintuitive because you would think, they're poorly differentiated, they're not dividing, that's better, but they're refractory to chemotherapy. So it's like, they call it take 22 or half a dozen in one hand, 6 in the other. And this is because cancer chemotherapeutic agents usually work in the S or M phase. So you kind of, in order to treat them, you want them to be dividing. So you want to catch it early when they're still dividing, because it's not so long after they starts to grow that these cells start to differentiate or go into the G0 phase. And then you can't, the chemo drugs don't really touch them. So something you can do is like debride the tumor or cut into it to get it to start growing, just so you can treat it and start killing the cells. So tumors with a low percent of cells in the replicating pool will be almost refractory to therapy. Another reason for the early detection. Yes?
So if we debride them, or do we have a chance of letting the neoplastic cells get into the blood and going somewhere else?
If that's going to happen, that's going to happen anyway. But there is something called seeding of neoplastic cells, so you do have to be careful when you're doing surgery that you don't cut into the tumor cells and then cut somewhere else, because you can plant those cells that are on that scalpel somewhere else. That's what you're more concerned about, is transferring the neoplastic cells. But the tumor has its own blood supply. So if they're going to get into the bloodstream, they're probably just going to get into the bloodstream. I don't think debriding would cause that. Okay. So most cells enter the non-proliferative pool relatively early in the growth of a tumor, which means relatively early in the growth of a tumor, they may be refractory to chemotherapy. And I have a diagram to hopefully help you visualize this. So initially, the tumor is expanding, the cells are dividing, and all of this is in the proliferative pool. So a high percentage early on is in the proliferative pool, a low percentage is in the non-proliferative pool. But as time goes on, you have less in the proliferative pool and more in the non-proliferative pool. Okay, they're in the G0 part of the cell cycle. They either differentiate or die. You still have that population continually growing and causing the tumor to get bigger, but this is the only population that will respond to the chemotherapeutic drugs. So that's where a lot of the problems come in, the people with cancer. We're going to get into and remember though, these things are dividing exponentially. So you already have a really, really big tumor here usually, depending on the growth rate, the size, the tumor. So even though this is early on, you still have a good amount of cells. So by the time, before these cells start going out of the cell cycle, you should have been able to detect the tumor and start treatment. So the growth rate depends on the growth fraction, which is those percentage of cells that are actively dividing, and the degree of imbalance between the cell production and cell loss. The growth fraction is not very important in determining the overall growth rate. The growth rate is determined primarily by the rate of cell loss. And mechanisms of cell loss include apoptosis, cell differentiation and going out of the cycle and dying, and lack of blood supply, so ischemia or necrosis. and also immunologic attack. The body does try to fight off neoplasms. And one of the reasons why tumors are so able to kind of just keep, to ward off the body's defense is they become their own little, there's a word I'm looking for, they become autologous. They are able to take care of themselves. They don't need the body to produce VEGF for them because they produce VEGF to make blood cells come in. Or they find ways to not be under the effect of the apoptotic pathway. And so you'll have this tumor with like, a billion cells, and each different cell will have different mechanisms to help with the survival of the whole. It's really, to me, like a little army, and each cell has its function to make sure the whole family of soldiers survives. It's sad, but it's still kind of ingenious the way it works. It's like viruses. I'm like, how does something not alive do this? Anyway, so how's the cancer detected? Are there any questions? Oh. So the transformed cell produces a clinically detectable tumor after 30 doublings. So 30 doublings exponentially results in a 1 gram mass of 10 to the 9 cells, which is a billion, right? 10 to the 9, a billion? 73, 1,000, a billion cells. How long does this take? It really, really just depends. It depends on the growth rate of the tumor. And it really varies depending on how aggressively this tumor grows. Let's see, head over here. Okay. For fast-growing tumors, it could be 2 to 3 months before you can detect it. And in slow-growing tumors, it could be as long as a year or more. So this depiction is in Robbins and Cotran from 2004. I don't remember what edition that is. But it's just kind of showing the progression of the development of a neoplasm, where you have a normal cell. Ooh, how do you know this?
The arrow? Yeah.
A normal cell, a single tumor cell that's become transformed, and then it doubles 30 times. And then you have a 1 gram mass, which is not very big. Like, imagine a gram of salt. But it's something that you should be able to feel and something you should be able to see with diagnostic techniques. So this is the smallest so a billion cells is the smallest clinically detectable mass. After only 10 more doublings, it is now 1 kilogram, which is 1 trillion cells. And this is, I don't necessarily agree with this statement, but it says the maximum mass compatible with life. So I would say the maximum mass compatible with life in a vital organ. I mean, if it's on the leg, okay? And this is just showing metastasis to the liver. The liver and the lung are going to be your most common places for metastatic neoplasm to go. So you always, anytime you have a malignant neoplasm, particularly when you know it's an aggressive one that tends to metastasize, those are the places you will continually monitor to see if it has progressed to that stage. So we say you have the transformation is in when you get that 1 tumor cell that has started dividing. When it starts dividing, it's called progression, where you have a proliferation of the genetically unstable cells. And then you get the tumor cell heterogeneity, which is what I was just referring to, which is demonstrated over here. So you have the normal cell, transformed cell that starts to divide. And so all these different colors represent the heterogeneity of the tumor cells that have different properties. Okay? So this one is non-antigenic, meaning it will not respond to the body's attempts to kill it. This one is invasive. This one is metastatic. This one produces growth factors, and so on and so forth. Oh, okay, so that's all I have for that one. Thought I had something behind this. Oh, it does?
How do tumors grow?
Oh.
Yeah.
I had to click on it. Okay, so how do tumors grow? So tumors, as we've already said this, but again, tumors grow because there is an imbalance between cell production and cell loss. Usually not enough cell loss, and so production just keeps going. Define homeostasis between cell growth and cell loss, that is the hallmark of normal cell proliferation, is disrupted in tumors. Host factors that can affect tumor cell growth are your blood supply, enzymes secreted by the tumor cells, and hormones. Many tumors have steroid receptors to hormones. So the best example is breast cancer and their receptors for estrogen. And so estrogen stimulation can cause these tumors to grow. Or we'll say estrogen priming results in neoplasia when they are exposed to the estrogen again. Which is why it is extremely important to spay your dogs. Are there questions? No? Do you have any questions for me? Okay. So I know like old school thinking is, you don't want to spay, you want to let them have one heat and one litter. And they're going to have mammal tumors. So, because when you spay them before their first heat, like the incidence, I have a graph somewhere, I think it's in another chart later, it's like 1 in 100. But if you wait until after the first heat, I mean, it drops drastically, like 1 in 25. And then if you do it after the second heat,